Hey, what's going on? This is KextNext, and welcome back to my mini tutorial series. My last video, we took a look at modeling and shading this missile that we have here, and today we're going to focus on creating smoke trails coming from behind it without having to create a smoke simulation. We're going to make it out of completely procedurally created clouds. Actually following the CG Matter tutorial, I'll put a link in the description. And also, if you don't want to model this missile like we did in the last tutorial, I'll be sure to put a link to my Patreon page where it will be downloadable, and I will appreciate your support. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. First thing we want to do is create our quote-unquote sprite. Technically, it's just an instance that we're going to use for our particles. So what we're going to do is hit Shift A on the keyboard to create a mesh and create a cube. We're going to move this cube off to the side over here. And as CG Matter says in his tutorials, Eevee does not render volumetrics very well, and we are going to make this effect in Eevee. Although we can do some more interesting particle effects and cycles, I want to do this in a real-time render engine. So let's scale this cube up just a little bit, and we want to make sure that Eevee's samples are turned up just a bit. We want to go into the volumetrics tab under the render tab, and make sure your tile size is set to a lower number. 2 takes a little bit longer to render, but 4 and 2 both look nice. I'm going to do 4, and make sure volumetric shadows are enabled with shadow samples at 32. All right, so now that we have that, let's go ahead and go to our shading workspace up at the top, and we're going to switch this to rendered view. All right, first thing we want to do is actually go to the material tab and create a new material for our cube. And we want to go over here to our nodes and make sure it's set to object. And zoom out a little bit if you can't find your nodes. And our nodes are right here. So we actually want to delete our principled BSDF down here. And we're going to hit Shift A to create a gradient texture. And we're going to plug our color into the volume tick right here. And we're going to change linear to quadratic sphere. And if you have Node Wrangler enabled, select your gradient texture and hit Control T to give you a texture coordinate mapping node. If you don't have Node Wrangler enabled, which is just a simple add-on in preferences, you can type it in, Node Wrangler, and enable it. But if you don't have that enabled, you can hit Shift A and just create a mapping and a texture coordinate node. All right, now that we have that, we're going to move these out of the way. And also we want to kind of put our sphere in the middle of our cube here. So we can go to the scale. If we click and drag, we can adjust these accordingly. It looks like it needs to be scaled down just a bit, maybe. And maybe change the location as well. All right, so now we have a sphere, a volumetric sphere in the middle of our cube. Next thing we want to do is hit Shift A and add a math node set to multiply. We're just going to go down here and move these a little bit farther out of the way, hit Shift A and add a principled volume node. Just set that in the middle and make sure that the value is plugged into the density socket right here. And you can kind of see the sphere. I don't know if you can see it on my screen, but if we take our multiply node right here and multiply it by a high number, I think in CG Matter's tutorial, he multiplies it by 500, which will result in a very visible sphere. Also, make sure to change the color to white. But the sphere is very visible. For our clouds, you might want to make them a little bit thinner, so maybe about like 220 would be a good number. And you can see our sphere here. It doesn't look super great, but we're going to do some more things to it. I'm not going to completely explain what I'm doing here because CG Matter explains it a lot better than I ever will be able to, but I'll try my best. So we're going to hit Shift A and add in a noise texture, and this will actually create the shapes of our clouds. And we want to set it to 4D. Hit Shift A to add a vector math node and set it down in between our texture coordinates and our mapping node, and plug in our noise textures factor to the other vector socket in our add node. And of course, we kind of want to reposition our cloud to be in the middle here. So maybe we can take these numbers and change them just a bit, maybe -3, and then change these to 3. And now we have our little cloud in the middle here, and we can actually adjust the settings in the noise texture to affect the shape of our cloud, like the scale and the detail of our cloud. And also what CG Matter does in his tutorial, which I think will be helpful for our case, is he adds an object info node to this setup, and he plugs the location into the W value, which will, I think, randomize the cloud depending on the position All right, now let's add some light into our scene so we can see this a bit better. So we can hit Shift S, cursor to selected, and then hit Shift A and add in a sun lamp right here. And it's coming down from above. We can move it up a little bit, which won't really do anything, but it helps me to visualize where it's coming from. Maybe turn the strength up to 2.5-ish, maybe 3. And that looks pretty good. And then we can hit Shift D to duplicate it. And we just kind of want to drag it around a little bit. By the way, G is to move, and then you can hit X, Y, or Z to move it along those axes. So I'm gonna hit G and Z to move it down a little bit. And then I'm gonna hit R, X to rotate it along the Z axis. And we have our little cute volumetric cloud here. And you can see it's a little ugly actually now that I look at it. So if we go back into the render tab, go to volumetrics and change the tile size to 2, it could help us a little bit more. All right, now that we have what we want, let's go back into the layout tab over here. And we can't really see anything. I mean, we kind of can, but it's not really showing up. And we are in material view right here, and we should be able to see our cloud. So to fix that, click this little arrow right here and select scene light, and we can see our cloud better. If you want to, you can actually use your HDRI that you've loaded in for your scene world, but I don't know. I don't like to see it in the background, so I just keep it off. All right, so let's go ahead and select all of these objects and kind of move them out of the way for now, because now we have our instancing object. And let's go ahead and save our project, Control S. Next thing we want to do is actually set up a motion path for our missile to follow. So let's go ahead and hit Shift S and put the cursor back at the world origin. That looks pretty good. Then we're actually gonna go to solid view just so that our computer will render this a little bit faster. And we can turn off our missile. Let's actually rename it, call it missile. And we'll call the cube our cloud. All right, let's move this missile out of the way with G and then X. We want to hit Shift A, go to curve, and select Bezier. Bezier. I don't know how you say it. It's one of those. It's weird. It's a weird word. Anyways, we're going to take our little curve here and scale it up a bit. And maybe scale it up a bit more. We want to make this curve pretty big. And we can hit Tab to go into edit mode, and we can select this point and this point down here. Right click, hit subdivide, and then we can take these points and kind of move them around. Move this one up a bit. So the missile's kind of going down. Right now, I'm just kind of playing around with this motion path, making it kind of an interesting path for the missile to follow. Maybe we can take all of them and scale them up a bit. Like that. All right, we kind of have an interesting path now for our missile to follow. And missiles tend to move in a straight line. I'm sorry, I'm kind of getting a little too crazy with it. They tend to go very fast, and you can't really tell that they're moving. Maybe if you want like a targeting missile, you could create a path for that, but I'm gonna keep my missile on a straight line. And it's not gonna be completely straight. I actually do like some of the variation that's in it, like this, how it kind of swoops in down here. I think that would look cool later on. Maybe add another point down here. All right, we kind of have a path for our missile to follow. I realize it's a bit too big, so we're gonna hit A and then S to scale everything down by just a touch. About like that's fine. All right, so what we wanna do is actually tab out of edit mode, and we wanna hit Shift A and create a new empty. Let's do a plain axis empty. And we're actually going to take this empty, and we'll call it parent object. Well, I guess let's call it parent because it's not really an object, it's an empty. And we'll shift select this curve, and we'll hit Control P, and we'll hit path constraint. And that will move our empty down here to the end of the path. If we move forward in our timeline, it won't do anything yet. And that's because we have to go into the empties constraints tab. And if we move the offset, it should move our empty along the path. Pretty cool. And we want to check this little box that says follow curve, and that will adjust the empty's orientation to be with that of the curve, which will come in handy later on. All right, next thing we want to do is make sure that our empty is selected, hit Shift S and select cursor to selected. And then I'll move our cursor there. Then we can select our missile, hit Shift S and select selection to cursor. And that will move our missile there. And we just want to kind of align the missile with the curve. So if we hit 3 on the numpad, well, maybe 1, on the numpad. And then we can go over here to the missile and just kind of rotate it down a bit. And maybe hit 7 to go into a top view. 7, and just kind of move it over here. And R, rotate it like that. All right, that looks pretty good. But now you can see, well, let's actually set the start frame to 0 because it's annoying me. You can see that it's not moving with the empty, or I'm sorry, if we were to move the empty, it wouldn't move with it. So one thing that I think is important is to select the parent object and scale it up just a bit so you can see it a bit better. And then select your missile and then select the empty with Shift and hit Control P object. And now if we were to move our empty across the line, our missile moves with it. Perfect, right? And it should actually rotate to follow the curve as well. So before we do anything else, let's just kind of animate our empty along this curve. So we can go ahead and set a keyframe for offset, maybe at 0, I think is the starting point. Set a keyframe by pressing I on the keyboard and hovering over offset, and then move forward, I don't know, 65-ish frames, and move it all the way to the end, which I guess would be negative 100%. And hit I again to set the keyframe. Now if we scrub between these, our missile is moving along the curve. That actually looks a bit slow to me. Oh, and by the way, if you want to edit the path a little bit, you can select the path, hit tab, and just kind of play with the points a bit. You can even just, G, Z, and you can see everything will move along with it. So that's pretty helpful, I think. All right, I think the missile is moving a bit slow, so we can actually select our parent object, and you can see our keyframes down here. If I drag it up a little bit, you can kind of move this one, the end keyframe, a bit closer to the other one, about there. And if we start it, maybe a little bit closer actually, 40. And again, maybe if you wanted to, you could actually have this missile be moving super fast. I don't know. Let's say I'm gonna set it at 30 frames just for the sake of the tutorial. It's gonna be moving a little bit slow, but it'll be cool. All right, so now let's go ahead and set up our emitter. So we're gonna go to our missile here, select it, and go into edit mode with tab, and we wanna kind of create an emitter out of the back of this missile. So to do that, we're just going to go to our vertex selection mode and hit Control R to add an edge loop in here and make it relatively big, maybe like that. And we're actually gonna hit P and separate the selection. And now we should have another, if we go in here, we should see we have another object. And we actually wanna dissolve the vertices that we've just created inside of our missile object. Actually hit X and dissolve edges. There we go. All right. Now we have a separate object in here. Let's tab out of edit mode. We have a separate object called missile.001. We'll actually double click that and rename it to emitter. And we want to tab into edit mode, and let's actually get rid of the subdivision surface modifier on it. And we can scale it down a little bit. And you can just hit F to fill it with a face. All right, we're actually gonna move it back a little bit. And to do that, we'll set the transform orientation to local and set this to individual origins, and then hit G and then Y. Well, move it back along its axis back here, because there's kind of a buffer. And we know our cloud over here is pretty big, so we don't want it kind of encroaching into the missile's geometry, so just kind of move it back a bit. And remember, after you mess with the orientations, be sure to set them back to global and whatever, so it's not screwy later on. I think my meta was about there in the original. Anyways, let's set our transform orientations back to global and tab out of edit mode, and we want to parent this emitter to our parent object, which I guess it already is, so we don't have to worry about that. Perfect. If it's not, though, you can just select it, shift select the emitter, Control P, parent to the object. You know how it goes. All right, so in this emitter, let's go ahead to the particle tab and create a new particle system. All right, now if we were to play this, you can see we have particles along this path, but they're falling because of gravity. Clouds stay up in the air because they are less dense than air itself. And we don't really want these particles to be affected by gravity, even though technically they are in the real world. So we're gonna go to the particle settings down here, go to the field weights tab and set gravity to 0. Now if we were to go back to the frame 0 and play it, we have a bunch of particles along a path. Perfect. Next thing we want to do is go to the render tab, and where it says render as halo, set that to object. And we want to go down here to the object options, I guess, and set the instancing object to the cloud. And you can barely see it. They're little square cubes because we actually have, because our cloud is made up of a cube over there. But if I go into material view, it'll take a second to load. I zoom in, there are little tiny clouds all over in these little cubes, but they are too small for us to see. So what we're going to do is increase the size. So in the render tab, we can turn the scale up relatively large. And in fact, let's kind of zoom into our missile over here. We want to make sure that there's not really a big gap between our particles and the missile, so we can turn them up pretty large. And it is okay if your particles overlap, by the way. It's actually preferred because the volumes will kind of blend into each other. And maybe turn up the scale randomness to like 0.2, something like that, to kind of give our clouds a bit of a random assignment. If we go into the material view, we can see this much better. Look at this, we can turn off our overlays to see it better. Look at that. So if we want to kind of keep in mind real world scale when rendering our objects because of the clipping problem. So if we look at our missile here, it says it's 50 feet long, which I think is like 14 meters in the metric system. But we want to make this missile a bit smaller. So to do that, let's just kind of scale it down until it's about, I think a real world missile would probably be like, I don't know, 6 foot, more than 6 foot, something like that. So now our missile is minuscule while our particles are still pretty big, and so is everything else. So we're actually gonna take our little path here and scale it down until it looks proportional to the missile. Maybe up a little bit more. And then also take our emitter and scale it down. So because I've kind of made this mistake, we're gonna have to readjust the particle scale settings, which is okay, it's not that big a deal. I just go into the scale and scale them down just a touch, until like right there. That's cool. All right, and we can kind of re-render them out. Pretty cool. Maybe we could even take the path and scale it up a bit. Wow, that's pretty cool. All right, now one thing that we do want to do in relation to the particle emitter is make sure that it knows to stop emitting particles by the time our path has reached the end. Let's go into the solid view one more time, go to our parent. We want to make sure that they stop emitting particles on frame 30. So go to the emitter and go to the end and change this to frame 30 and the start frame to 0. And we want to change the number of particles down to 200. All right, let's play that now. Pretty cool. All right, one more thing that we want to do is go to the physics tab and change the Brownian force up a little bit. Let's see what that did. Oh, and also the lifetime of the particles is important as well. So we'll set the lifetime to something like 75. Maybe turn the Brownian up to something like 3. Let's try that. Maybe less than that. Let's try 1.5. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. And we'll kind of cut our animation off at frame 75. And just to make sure that looks cool, we'll go to the material view We'll stop our animation actually at frame 31. All right, one more thing that we actually want to change in our emitter settings is if we go down to the render tab, we want to uncheck show emitter. All right. And let's just render these particles. Let's kind of like bake these particles really quick. We'll go to the rendered view so we can see it a bit better and turn off all overlays. So our smoke trail looks pretty cool, but you can kind of see there's a bit of a tiling effect going on there, it looks like. So we can kind of correct that by adjusting the randomness of our particle system. So we can crank the number of particles up to something like 250 maybe, and go down into the render tab and turn the randomness up to 0.5. See what that looks like. We have a bit more of a random assignment here. You can also turn the scale of the particles up to maybe 0.4, creates more of a thick smoke trail. All right, now one more thing that we actually want to do is let's go into solid view over here, and we want to go to our cloud object. Maybe turn the overlays back on so we can see it a bit better. We go to material view. And of course you can adjust the detail of the cloud by going into pulling up the shader editor right here and changing it to the shader editor. Actually, let's go into solid view just to get rid of the lag real quick. Go into the noise texture, and you can see maybe we want our clouds to be a little bit less detailed, so we'll kind of turn the scale down on them. 4.5 is probably a good number, and maybe distortion will give it more of that fuzzy look. Maybe leave that at 0. Well, like 0.2. All right, let's take a look at our missile over here. All right, we're just gonna kind of let that render real quick, and we'll see what it looks like when it's done kind of compiling. That actually looks pretty cool. I like that smoke trail a lot. All right, let's go ahead and go into rendered view. You can see it a little bit better. Yeah, now we have our little smoke trail and Eevee. Of course, we want to add some finishing touches to the smoke trail, like the light that comes off the thruster into the smoke trail. I think that's pretty important. So let's go ahead and just kind of bake our smoke trail here. And to do that, we will just kind of play through it once, go to the emitter settings, and then go to, let's actually get rid of this shader thing. All right, and then we can go to the cache and just hit current cache to bake. That'll make it so that we can't really make any changes to our particle system. We kind of want it to stay the same. All right, so let's go ahead and just kind of disable our emitter for right now. And we want to add some lights to our scene. So let's go ahead and hit tab on the keyboard and just maybe grab this face in here and hit Shift S, and we'll do cursor to selected and tab out of edit mode just so that we have our cursor there. All right, so we'll actually hit Shift A and add in a new light, a point light. And if we turn our emitter back on, we go to the material view, we can see what this point light is doing. It's adding a lot of light into our scene, so behind the rocket. So we'll actually crank the power up to something like 1000, something crazy like that. And we'll change the color to kind of an orangish color. Also, if you want your clouds to have more detail, of course you can just go into the cloud and then the shader editor and turn up the scale of the cloud or the detail. I actually may want more detail. I'll change this to 11, hit enter, and go back to the layout tab. Yeah, and you can see we have a lot more detail in the clouds now. All right, so let's actually select our point light and make it a little bit more orange, a little bit more aggressive like that. That looks pretty cool. So now that we have this point light, we want it to stay tracked to the back of the rocket. But before we do that, we actually want to create some more lights to create more of this light fall off from the rocket. So move forward 1 frame, and we're actually going to hit Alt D to duplicate this light but have it stay linked, and kind of go into the top view. We want to position this light on the curve that our missile is following. So I'm just going to keep on creating these lights, hitting Alt D, and just kind of duplicating them up to the back of the rocket. All right, so now we're gonna take all of our lights here, all of our point lights, and then select our parent object and hit Control P and parent them to the object. And now all of our point lights should move with our missile. Now I'm gonna leave you with one more quick tip before I end the tutorial, and that's that you can actually parent force fields to the back of the missile with fall off. So if you want like these particles to kind of shoot off from the back of the missile, but only in the proximity, but only when they're close to the missile, when they're being emitted, we can actually go ahead and we'll turn off the emitter for now so that we can kind of see what we're doing. And we can hit Shift A and add in a force field, and we'll do we'll do wind. Do a wind force field, and kind of position your view to be looking right into the barrel, I guess, of your missile, and go to the alignment and select view. And so it should kind of be aligned to where you are looking. And then we can kind of scale it down a little bit so it matches up a little bit better, position it a bit better into the back of the rocket. So now we have our little force field here. We want to create some fall off. So we'll go to the physics settings, and we want to turn the strength up a bit, maybe like this. So it's really zoom in here, and go to the fall off shape, set it to sphere, turn up the power a little bit, and turn on use minimum and use maximum and crank up the values. You can see it's created this dotted line around it, and that is where your effect will be happening. It'll kind of be a gradient between the minimum and maximum. Everything inside of the minimum distance will be affected, and nothing outside the maximum distance will be affected. And I guess you could say it's kind of like a gradient in between these two. So we can kind of crank this up a bit, so we kind of have a sphere behind it. And of course, take the field, shift select the parent object, Control P, and parent it to the object. So this force field will move with the missile. And you will have to rebake your particles. So if you go to your emitter tab and go to the particle settings, you have to go in here and hit delete bake. So you can kind of see the wind is pushing these particles back from it. Maybe the fall off could be a bit bigger. In fact, maybe we could like kind of keep it in the light. All right, maybe turn the strength up to 50 just to keep it a round number. Yeah, that looks pretty cool. So they're kind of being shot out from the missile. And now that we have that, we can just go to the emitter and the particle settings and hit current cache to bake. And now go to our rendered view. We can see our beautiful smoke trails. I like to turn off the overlays so we can see it better. And when it's in render view, it might do some weird stuff like this, like have lights all the way throughout it, but that's just because it takes a little while to render. If we zoom in here, actually we can select our missile. You can't really see it because I've turned overlays off, but hit period on the numpad. Kind of center our missile into our view. As a matter of fact, let's set up a quick little camera scene right here. We'll hit Shift A, create a camera, hit 0 to go into the camera settings, and then we'll go into view, and if you select lock camera to view, you can kind of look around a little bit better. Just kind of go in here to the missile, and maybe go to the camera settings and crank up the size of the view, something like that. And we will uncheck this, go to rendered view, and there we go. We have a really cool looking little missile. And of course you can adjust your sun lamps a bit. So like if you wanted to, you can go over here and I don't know if you can see it, but kind of rotate it a little bit. All right, but I think that looks pretty good. And you have this fully procedural, animatable smoke trail that will follow this missile along a path with a pretty cool little lighting setup. I think my lights might be a little too close together, my point lights. So there is actually a very simple little fix for that. And that is just called spreading them out. So we'll just select them all, change the pivot point to the active object, and scale them out. You might have to readjust them along the curve though, sadly. It actually stayed pretty well. If we go back to rendered view, turn the emitter on. I forgot that might be important. Yeah, buddy, that looks pretty cool. And almost the most important part is if you go into the render tab up here and enable bloom, you get some crazy glow, and it looks amazing. I love bloom in Eevee. It's so great. Maybe you can mess with the threshold a little bit, and of course activate motion blur if you're doing any kind of camera movements. But yeah, I think that looks pretty good. I hope you enjoyed my little tutorial on how to create a cool looking missile strike inside of Blender. Again, please check out my Patreon page and support me if you can. It would mean a lot, and it will help me create more content like this. And if you do want to see more like little small little tutorials, I will be posting more on my Patreon page every now and then, so be sure to check that out. Thank you so much for watching my videos. If you have any questions or comments, concerns, requests, I guess, leave them in the comments below. Thank you so much. I am KextNext, and I will see you next time.